Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and this will be a series of videos addressing certain issues related to the Holocaust. This particular video will focus on bystanders during the Holocaust. First of all, we will find that the definition of bystander is somewhat ambiguous, and people and researchers and policymakers have different definitions. Staub states that a bystander is a witness who is in a position to know what is happening and in a position to take positive action. So that's the definition that Staub provides. And Staub points out that there's active bystanders that help others, and there's passive bystanders that send a message to the perpetrators that their behavior is acceptable or tolerated. Bystanders have less empathy and model a lack of action for others, so they serve as very poor role models, and they encourage the passivity that we see. And Staub offers some programs to increase active bystandership. For example, positive, caring role models, feeling responsibility to others, moral courage, and altruism from suffering. So Dr. Staub has a whole series of workshops and additional information if you wanted to pursue that on upstandards, on getting people to help and assist and develop empathy and react appropriately to help others. Goldberg presents a variety of questions that I think are relevant that we could address in this particular workshop, or you could address with your students or your own research. Where are the writings about bystanders? That's one of the things I found pretty much right away, is that I'd done a lot of research on perpetrators, a lot of research on victims, and then when it came to bystanders, I was almost, whoa, I don't have much in my own personal library on bystander, on the bystander, and why? What's going on there? There is a good amount of literature out there, but it seems relatively small compared to the literature on perpetrators and victims. How do bystanders explain themselves? How are their identities ambiguous? What role do bystanders play? How guilty are the bystanders? How do they benefit? And how do you differentiate that area between bystander and perpetrator? And that's what we're going to see, is that there's going to be a lot of cases where someone could be a bystander, and then they could be a perpetrator, and then they could be a rescuer, and then they could be a victim. They could be all four of those. And do bystanders need to be present at the crime scene? So what we'll see, of course, is that there's people that engaged in passivity or allowing all kinds of violence to take place without intervening, and they may have been close to the scene or they may have been very far from it. There's also changing views, and I know one of the features I was asked to discuss here is more of a macro level, larger approach on bystanders as nations. And so I'll kind of weave that in and out of my discussion. But Barnett talks about, at a societal level, in other countries, there is a relationship between helping behaviors and the level of Nazi control, the spread of ideology, high threats, and the integration of the victim group. So what we see is there's social characteristics that seem to encourage or discourage bystander behavior. And there's a lot of ethical issues too that we could address with bystanders. For example, the decisions to respond, the vulnerability of the victims, and the responsibility that people have and societies have and institutions have to protect others. Ways to address the complicity with the bystanders, and also the implications for their behavior. Hilberg has produced a wealth of work on bystanders, and Dr. Hilberg says we need to look at the historic, the cultural, and the situational variables of the nations. So we'll see that there's debate on how much is related to situational, or the situation that someone finds themselves in within a society, versus choice or agency, the ability to make a choice and exert one's own free will on taking or not taking action. And Hilberg also says we need to look at how nations viewed and treated Jews. How did the nations view and treat Jews? And we'll see that anti-Semitism was rampant throughout a variety, in all these countries, and in some countries it was more virulent than others, and that certainly can have an effect as well. And Hilberg says we need to look at the helpers, gainers, messengers, and the onlookers, that there's obviously different levels of help. And also to look at the allies, the neutral countries, and the role of the churches. Bar-On talks about the bystander in relation, and Bar-On views bystanding behavior as situational and not necessarily a personality trait. And Bar-On talks about 5 psychosocial constructs that support bystanding behavior. The idea of minding your own business, the gradual adjustment to public violence, where it just seems to be an everyday occurrence and people become accustomed or used to it, if you will. A just world regarding the victim. They see that perhaps the victim has responsibility, the erroneous, irrational thought that the victim is responsible. And paradoxical morality, what is seen as good is really bad, and what is seen as bad is really good. So there's that reversal in that sense, where they are able to justify their lack of intervention. And also claiming not to be able to describe or discuss, because these are indescribable or undiscussable issues. So we see that sometimes as well. People just don't talk about these things. Certainly I've seen that in my research before when I've delved into certain topics. People have told me, no, you don't want to discuss that. That's something we just don't discuss. And usually it's something that is going to create a bit of or a lot of uncomfortableness in that discussion. And we can begin to ask some questions. Bar-On recommends, under what conditions do people move in and out of the bystander role? And why do bystanders seem stuck in the role? And what about those that are actually involved in planning stages? So they're the administrators, if you will. They create laws, they create rules, they're the policy makers. They may not actually carry out the physical violence, but they are clearly planners and responsible for it. And what about the emotional aspects related to bystanding behavior? And when we look at all this, just to summarize briefly in thinking about different levels of analysis in sociology and in other social sciences, researchers will focus on micro, meso, and macro level variables. The micro are more of the individual interactions between people in close groups, understanding an individual perpetrator, a small perpetrator group, or a family. Meso are organizations and social groups, such as schools and communities. And then the macro are the larger groups, the social institutions, such as the legal and criminal justice systems, the religious system, the political system, the economic system, educational system, and so forth. And really, we can move back and forth in all of this to look at the macro, meso, micro level, behaviors and understandings and how it all is related. And that's really a a strong, part of the sociological view. Adams and Balfour, in their book Unmasking Administrative Evil, talk about moral inversion, the belief that a person and an organization are doing good. That we talked about that paradoxical morality a few minutes ago. But here we have this whole idea that a person doing a terrible thing, an organization doing a terrible thing, creating havoc, death, destruction, but somehow believing that they're doing something appropriate, that they're doing something that's needed, that they're doing something good. So the so-called morally neutral positions are brought into play in terms of doing morally neutral tasks. So if people view themselves as part of the organization and just carrying out neutral tasks, they don't see themselves as basically desk murderers, if you will. And so policies were created to remove Jews through technical professionals, as we'll see in a few minutes, and the organizations adapted to the Nazi policies. To quote Adams and Balfour, public servants were both willing and helpless in the face of great evil. Today they remain just so because administrative evil wears a mask. And anytime, for example, in sociology, in psychology and anthropology, whatever the case might be, in criminal justice and criminology, when we're studying, for example, organizational crime, white-collar crime, corporate crime, whatever, that we get that whole idea. We've seen some horrific behavior from corporations, and we try to analyze that and understand how did that occur, and then we start talking to these people, and a lot of these same concepts that we'll be talking about today relate as well. So this is the introduction basically to bystanders, and the ambiguity I mentioned, and the lack of research compared to victims and perpetrators and rescuers, and the debates and the changing nature of the terms. And so what I'd like to do then is to stop this video right here, and then the next video we'll pick up and we'll start talking about moral psychology and looking at how are bystanders different from rescuers or perpetrators.